So back to the talk for this evening. This is really what I'm going to try and cover, which is really a little bit about what is welfare, which we kind of think we know what we mean as vets, but we tend as vets to often go back to actually animal health rather than animal welfare. What is organic farming? And why I think it's important that vets need to know about this. And I'm going to give you a little bit of background about the organic certification structure in the UK and the food market, and about how you can use medicines in organic farming, and a few sort of species specific things, and then some examples at the end. And hopefully we'll have plenty of time for chat. I've also got some polls in this. So if you've got smartphones handy, I'll give you a bit of warning. I'm going to do a couple of Mentimeter smart polls through your smartphone, just to make sure everyone's awake. So we've got one coming up now. I'm going to just switch this around, and I will. First of all, I want to just check that you are able to see this and it works. So can you go to menti.com if you have a smartphone, and there's a code at the bottom down here. If you can enter your code on your smartphone, this is just a try out and see if this works. Okay, I think we've got a few of you there. So this is just a test question here. Who would you rather have lunch with? Let's see if this is working. Okay, that's looking fairly overwhelming. Okay, well, obviously we're all concerned about Elon Musk monitoring our social media activity. So, right, we're all big Michelle Obama fans. That's good to know. Right, so Menti is working. And I want you to just type in, you should have a free text box that you can type into. I want to make sure that this works. Okay. Good stuff. Well, it's good to know the tech is working. Right. I am going to save all of these responses. Right. So we know that works. So I'm going to now just escape out of that and just get you to ask. I'm going to ask another poll. So okay. Hopefully you can all see that. My current knowledge about organic farming is good. Would you say it was good, patchy, or poor? Patchy. Okay. I'm going to ask a similar question at the end, and I hope I don't get patchy and poor at the end. Another question for you here. This is a statement. Animal welfare is better on organic farms. Tell me what you think. This is deliberately provocative. Okay, that's interesting. Bit of uncertainty, you keep switching. Okay. And I want you to, given what you've just answered in the previous question, can you tell me how or why animal welfare might be different on organic farms? Okay, it's some really interesting comments that have come up on that from you all. I think not surprisingly, a lot of these are relating to drug treatment and use of medicines, or perhaps not using medicines. And hopefully we'll address some of those comments as we go through the slides. If there are any questions relating to that, then we'll pick up on those at the end. But I think those comments are really useful, and I will try and address those as much as I can do. But I think they're not uncommon, and I think those are concerns that are shared by your peers, and also as veterinary students, because I teach in Glasgow as well, but also by the wider veterinary profession. So we'll hopefully try and address those as we go through this. Okay. Right, I'm going to just now come out of that and come back to my talk. So I'm going to just pick up with what we think about when we are thinking about organic farming and when we think about animal welfare. So what I want to talk about now is what is welfare. Hopefully everyone can see my screen. Okay, so when we're talking about animal welfare, we're really talking about, importantly, behavior and the animal's affective state, how they actually perceive things and how they respond to things, as well as health and production. And I think as vets and vet students, we always gravitate towards health issues and production issues, and often conflate the two things together and think, you know, health is welfare and welfare is health. And often you'll find that written in statements, you know, health and welfare. You know, you often see animal health and welfare, and it's a kind of sentence which does share a lot of similarities and a lot of things that are important, and the two are very much related, but they are, animal welfare is more than health. So I think what is important to consider is the broader definition of welfare. And how do we assess welfare? And you would have probably been familiar or are familiar with the concept of the 5 freedoms. And again, this comes up quite often in different presentations. So this was a concept of welfare assessment and the sort of baseline for animal welfare, which was originally developed in the latter half of this sort of, well, sort of 1960s, 1970s onwards. So the 5 freedoms: freedom from hunger and thirst, freedom from discomfort, freedom from pain, injury, and disease, freedom to express normal behavior, and freedom from fear and distress. But in recent years, particularly in the last 20 years, this has been a little bit more refined, and there's been a lot of work done by David Mellor in New Zealand in particular, and they redefined this. Instead of the 5 freedoms, as the 5 domains, and these domains relate to the 5 freedoms, but they place much more emphasis on the mental state and the experience of the animal in that environment or system or whatever it is, whether it's companion animal, farmed animal, wild animal, animal in a zoo. And the concept is basically saying that behavioral interactions, nutrition, health, and the physical environment the animal is in all feed into the animal's mental state and their experience and their overall welfare. And often this is sort of abbreviated into a concept called a life worth living. Has the animal got a life worth living? And you can apply this, as I say, universally across all animals. And the reason that this has been developed is to place much more emphasis on what's the animal feeling and experiencing, which is really important, because an animal can be free of disease and be appropriately fed, but have a really crap life. So I'm sure you can think of examples of that in some intensive systems. The animals are fed precisely, there's precision management of the diet, they don't have any disease, but they actually have a pretty rotten existence because they don't have the opportunity to express normal behavior, and their experience is not great, and they arguably do not have a life worth living. So there's a lot more emphasis put on those kind of more sentient feelings, if you like, of the animals that we're interacting with. So I want you to bear that in mind when you think about what I'm going to talk about in relation to organic farming. One of the biggest things people often struggle with is, what is organic farming? There is a overview organization called the International Federation of Organic Agriculture, which is IFOAM. And in 2008, they came up with a sort of definition, if you like, of organic farming, which is written on here. I'm not going to read the whole thing out to you, but essentially it's based around sustaining healthy soil, healthy ecosystems, and so being socially responsible, relying on normal biological or natural biological and ecological processes and adapting to local conditions rather than external inputs and generating adverse effects. It does emphasize, importantly, that it's not a retrospective system of farming. So it does combine tradition, but it also combines innovation and science to the benefit of that system. And there is a lot more emphasis placed in organic farming on the sort of bigger picture stuff. So, you know, are your workers paid fairly, and the sort of bigger system, rather than just sort of production. So these are the kind of underpinning ideals, I guess, that drive the regulation. So the system of organic farming largely is relating to maintaining long-term soil fertility, but it is also to do with working with natural biological cycles, using local or on-farm renewable resources, considering the social and ecological impacts, allowing livestock to perform natural behaviours, and avoiding external inputs. So the obvious things are fertiliser and feeds. And those are all kind of quite high-minded ideals, but what does that actually mean in practice? And most organic farms will be using a lot of legumes to fix nitrogen. That's a picture of red clover in a dairy farm grazing sward that I visited in England. Recycling manure and crop wastes. And so manure can be not just animal manure, but green manures, plants that are grown specifically to be ploughed into and fertilize the ground. Mechanical weed control, avoiding pesticides, herbicides, and so on. And having a much more closed farm system so that you're not bringing external things onto the farm. Rotating crops and rotating grazing, using resistant crops and animals, and as I said already, minimizing chemical and drug inputs into the farms. So that's the kind of principles that people are working with. One of the topics which has had a lot of airtime recently, and you may have heard about this, is sort of regenerative agriculture. It's something which is getting talked about a lot more within the mainstream farming press and online. And so some people have said, you know, what's the difference between organic and regenerative? So regenerative agriculture is basically describing farming and grazing practices that are aiming to rebuild soil organic matter and restore soil biodiversity. So it's very much a soil-based system. Soil is the starting point in sort of regen ag. And that's aiming to increase carbon storage and improve the water cycle. So the two are not exclusive. Lots of regenerative farms are organic, but not all organic farms are regenerative. And there are a couple of links that I've put there. I'm not sure if Alina can share these slides with you afterwards, but if not, I can sort of put all these links together afterwards for you. If you're interested in that, to read a little bit further about that. There's a lot of interest in regenerative farming across both the UK and the wider international side of things. And it's not just a kind of hobby farmer side of things either. So Nestle and some of the big multinational companies are starting to think about this as a way of improving their sustainability and their environmental impact. So it's an interesting time if you're interested in these more kind of sustainable approaches. So in the UK, the organic side of things is quite a small proportion of the farming system. So it's around 3% of the UK farmed area. Very slight increase since 2018, but not a huge increase. These figures are averaging out across all the farms. This is a total of all farms, but there are some very small farms in this, and there are some very big farms. So in Scotland, there are some quite large upland organic farms. Conversely, in other parts of the UK, there are some very, very small, kind of almost backyard type scenarios who are organic. So organic egg producers, for example. But the majority of organic land, 82% of it is pasture. So there's a lot more livestock than there is crops grown in the UK. And again, just to emphasize, this is a small percentage of UK livestock. So we're talking less than 5% of all, whatever species you're looking at, livestock are organic. The poultry numbers, interestingly, did increase a little bit last year, but we really are talking very small percentages of the overall amounts of animals that are farmed in the UK. So having said all of that, although it is a niche market, there's a really widespread distribution of organic holdings in the UK. So this map, which goes from the Shetland Isles in the north right down to the Scilly Isles in the southwest, each of these yellow dots is an organic holding, and they're really widely distributed. There's quite a lot of clustering around the southwest, which is a very strong sort of heartland of organic farming for a variety of reasons. But if you go into practice in the UK, if you're in mixed practice, if you're in farm animal practice, then you will have an organic client in your books. So I think it's really important to understand, if you're going to provide service to these clients, you know, what are some of the challenges, what are some of the issues, and how can you provide a good service to them? And just a little bit about the market in the UK, because this is what drives things. It's very much a consumer-led I suppose, system in many ways. Despite the cost of living crisis at the moment, and despite all the financial ups and downs, there's been 11 years of market growth. Not huge growth, but there is still growth, which is interesting given that other sectors are decreasing. So turnover is just over sort of 3 billion in the UK. All sectors last year increased, whether that's supermarket sales, online, independent shops, and public procurement. So the data suggests that nearly 40% of households are buying organic produce weekly, and that's usually dairy and fruit and veg. The really big seller is organic baby food. So more than 50% of pre-prepared baby foods are organic. And there's increasing amounts of it going into, as I say, catering and so on. McDonald's Happy Meals, if you ever have kids, then you get a Happy Meal, and then if you get a milk carton, it's organic milk. So there's quite a lot of organic produce going into those catering sources. So just to wake everyone up, this is another poll. So give me a second. This is a very short one. So this is organic purchasing. How often do you buy organic products? So that's food or non-food. Okay. Looks as if we have a pretty typical student audience. No frequent organic purchases here. Okay. That's everybody who's on Menti. And could you just type in again your reasons for your answer to the previous question? As I say, pretty typical student audience. Okay, it's interesting to see that immediately 3 of you have said money is an issue. And we could maybe pick up on the welfare comments as we go through this. I think that's really interesting what you've said. I would expect, as students, I would expect you to say, I'm poor. I'm not going to come out with any cheeky comments about you being in Cambridge and having loads of money. It's okay. I'm external examiner in Cambridge, so I can be rude to you. I'll see some of you in final year. I will go back to screen sharing. So, not surprisingly, you have said that money is an issue. If you poll the wider population, then the reasons why consumers say they purchase food is often, these are the sort of 5 reasons, and these have been done number of times, numerous surveys. I've had some students that went out and pounded the streets and asked consumers in Glasgow, and various other consumer surveys have all said the same thing. Consumers buy organic food because they think it's healthier. They comment on taste, but animal welfare is always in there. People always perceive, rightly or wrongly, that welfare is better. Environmental benefits are always listed. And then the other comment that comes up is more of an avoidance behavior. So avoiding genetically modified foods or food scares. So some of you might remember there was a horse meat contamination issue in food a few years ago. And at the same time as that happened, then organic meat sales increased. Organic food buyers tend to be from a higher educational background, and we can sort of maybe pick up on that later and discuss why that might be, whether it's to do with educational attainment or financial security that comes with perhaps a higher education, and female. And again, we can discuss whether that's mum doing the shopping or whether females are more concerned about the environmental welfare. So I'm just going to move briefly into a little bit about legislation, just to sort of explain how this works, because it is something that is a bit confusing. Since we left the European Union, we have now got a piece of sort of fossilized in time legislation, which was the European Council regulation, which set the baseline EU standard for organic production, which still applies in Northern Ireland because of the slightly odd arrangements post-Brexit with Northern Ireland. But we now have a piece of legislation which is applicable to the UK, which was a piece of European legislation, and that's the UK regulation. So that's the baseline of how organic farms have to farm, how they can kill foods, how they process foods, and how foods are processed and packaged and presented. There are 6 DEFRA approved certification bodies, which are listed on the slide here. And if you are an organic farmer, you have to be registered with one of these 6 certification bodies. and then you follow their rules. So those rules might be more strict than the baseline European/UK registration regulation is. But those rules are set by the certifying body, and you follow them, and then you are inspected and certified by the appropriate body. So they can add extra layers of strictness, if you like, onto that regulation. And we'll come to that in a second, because there are differences depending on who you're working with. If you do convert your farm to organic, very briefly, it's a 2-year conversion period of the land. If animals are slaughtered for meat, they have to be born and raised as organic. So you can't convert a lamb or a calf to become organic halfway through its life and sell it as organic. UK regulations do mean you have to have a herd or flock health plan detailing how you would approach the sort of disease control on that farm. It does say preferably with a vet, it doesn't have to be, but this is one area where you as vets or potential vets can have a really positive input into the farm. Farms generally are closed. You can buy in breeding replacements. You can buy in tups and bulls and so on. If you've got ruminants, then they've got to have 60% of their daily dry matter intake has got to be forage. So you can't have any high concentrate feeding rearing systems, and you're monitored annually. So in its best essence, if you're thinking about this in the best light, prevention of disease and evidence-based medicine is really central to that organic approach. And I would argue that that's no different to any other farm that you're dealing with. And hopefully at the end of this session, you'll realize that there's a lot of similarity and a lot of convergence between organic farms and non-organic farms, and hopefully you won't sort of think of them as being too dissimilar as we go on. So the herd or flock health plan has got to be appropriate to the farm. It's got to be bespoke. You can't just have a sort of template that you drag out for everybody. And ideally what you're aiming at is that you become less dependent on veterinary medicines as you go forward. And again, I would like to think that that's what all farms are aiming at. No farmer really wants to spend lots of money on medicines, and no vet should really ethically or morally be prescribing medicines for the sake of it. So I think with the way that farm animal practice is going, you'll find there's a lot of similarities, as I say, between your organic and your non-organic clients. So thorny issue of medicines, and this has come up in your poll at the beginning, and you've obviously got some concerns about this. I think the initial comment, and this is something that I, in my experience of working with farms and researching with organic farms over the last 15 years, if you've got a clinical justification for treating an animal, then you treat it. Nobody's going to argue. You're the professional, you're the vet. You can justify it. The rules state at the moment that complementary therapies, i.e. homeopathy, can be used if they're effective. And there's a little bit of nuance between complementary or alternative. So complementary would be used in parallel with conventional medicines. Alternative medicine would be used instead of. And I think this is where there's sometimes a little bit of a grey area, and sometimes where people get concerned. My feeling is that in reality, this is not a huge issue, but it is something that can build barriers between vets, between farmers, and between certification bodies that perhaps shouldn't be there. I was external examiner on a PhD thesis earlier this year, which was looking at complementary and alternative medicines in dairy farms. And one of the big take homes from that was that there is a lot of non-communication between vets and organic farmers, because the organic farmers don't want to talk to the vets because they think they just want to sell medicine, and the vets don't want to talk to the organic farmers because they think they don't want to listen to what they're going to say. So I think we do need to try and break those barriers down, because they're not, in my experience, often as significant as you think they are. And I personally have got no problem if a farmer wants to use a homeopathic remedy in parallel with a conventional medicine. I don't think that homeopathy is effective, but if they want to use it, I don't have a huge issue with that. But I don't think it's something that in reality is as big an issue as often people are concerned about. If you are using medicines, then you have to use licensed medicines as you would on any other farm. There's no difference there. There's a few things that you definitely can't do. You can't do blanket preventative treatments. So you cannot do blanket antimicrobial dry cow therapy. But increasingly in the dairy sector, in non-organic herds, this is not allowed either. And lots of farms are using selective dry cow therapy. You're not allowed to synchronize animals at a herd or a flock level. So you can't synchronize a group of animals to breed at the same time. You can't use growth promoters, but we can't use those in Europe anyway. Couple of things you are allowed to do. Strategic therapy is allowed. So a strategic worming dose. So a classic example would be to treat lambs for nematovirus prevention in the spring. That's absolutely allowed. Vaccination is allowed. There are some comments about using reduced valency if possible. So, you can get multivalent vaccines which have multiple antigens in them for different either bacterial or viral pathogens. And what it's really saying is, instead of using a kind of multivalent one, if you've only got one condition that you're concerned about, then try and use a single valency vaccine if you can. If you do have national or international disease control measures, you have to follow them. So I don't know if you're aware that blue tongue disease is spreading in Europe at the moment. There's sort of medium risk that we may get this into the UK next year. Last time this happened, which would be now about 15 years ago, we had to have compulsory blue tongue vaccination. And if that happens again, then organic farms would have to vaccinate. Organophosphates, OPs, are allowed by some certification bodies, but not others. And this is where you need to know who your farm clients are registered with. And all of them are restricting third and fourth generation cephalosporin and fluoroquinolone use for antibiotics, but that's really industry standard across all areas of farming now. So arguably, the organic farms were 15, 20 years ahead of the curve on this one. If you work with clients that are producing products for the USA, you're not allowed to use antibiotics. And I have a problem with this. In the States, you can't use antibiotics in organic farming at all. If you export milk to the US, then you're not allowed to use them. And some UK producers are aiming for antibiotic-free, but this is quite difficult. And I think this is problematic. And I know some farms have stopped doing this because it is problematic. So OMSCO is the Organic Milk Suppliers Cooperative. They say that they are organic, they are antibiotic free. But I do know some farmers have stopped selling milk through OMSCO because it is problematic. And I think this is probably swinging the pendulum too far in terms of minimizing medicines. If you are using products, same as any other farm, treatment records and withdrawal periods, the differences are longer withdrawal periods. So if you are working with the Soil Association, it's 3 times the withdrawal period. If it's other sector bodies, it's twice withdrawal period. Then there are some sort of quirky things. So if you've got a 0 withdrawal product, it's 48 hours. So there's a few kind of quirks. There's also a rule about only allowing 3 courses of treatment per animal in a year. So a course of treatment is all necessary measures to restore the animal to health. So that is not 3 injections, that's 3 courses of treatment. And vaccines and parasite treatments are not included in that. So we can come back if you've got any. I know that's quite a lot of information to take on board, but the bottom line of that is, yes, you can use medicines. Yes, you can use vaccines. Yes, you can use wormers. Yes, you can use antibiotics, but you need to be prudent. And I think that's exactly the message that I would say in any other farm. Withdrawal periods are longer, and you need to think carefully about that, particularly if you're doing work with dairy cows and you're using maybe reproductive hormones in an individual animal basis, or if you're administering antibiotics. However, it should not stop you from thinking you can use medicines. So just briefly, a few things to different species, and then we'll have a bit more chat. Just in relation to sheep, I think a lot of the issues with organic sheep production are very similar to conventional. So stocking rates are often very similar, same issues. Grassland management is really important. The biggest issue with sheep often is parasite issues, whether that's endo or ectoparasites. And a lot of the flock-based advice is applying to conventional farms. So if you're familiar with SCOPS, which is sustainable control of parasites in sheep, lots of the things they say in that are things that are relevant to organic farms. So the big issues are PGE, parasitic gastroenteritis, sheep scab, which is a really significant welfare issue. And there's lots of good advice and control measures that are being directed towards that. Interestingly, scab in Scotland is a notifiable disease, but it's not elsewhere in the UK. And fluke as well. That's another parasite that's a bit tricky to control. Biosecurity is really important. If you have got sheep who are free of foot rot, then don't bring it into your farm. If you have got sheep with foot rot, then for goodness sake, treat them. And vaccination is allowed. So clostridial disease, abortion prevention, foot rot vaccines, all allowed and encouraged to prevent disease. Dairy cattle, the differences here really are trying to maximize your productivity from forage, whether that's grazed or conserved. The milk price margin isn't huge, so organic milk producers don't get a massive increase in pence per litre compared to conventional. There's a lot of variation in herd size from very small, less than 20 cows, up to, hundreds of cows. It's really variable. Average herd size is about 200 cows, so that gives you an indication of the variety. There is a peak in spring milk production, which you can understand because people are taking milk from spring grass. There's been lots of debate as to whether Holstein cows are suited to organic farms. Can you feed them? I think the answer is yes, in the appropriate farm. These pictures are organic cattle from a farm in England, which manages pedigree Holstein cattle very well. Same issues as any other dairy farm: mastitis, fertility issues, lameness. The big game changer that happened over the last sort of 15 years has been the introduction of non-organic teat sealants, and they're really useful for organic herds. Selective dry cow therapy is allowed, but as I said already, you can't use blanket dry cow therapy. And the big difference, which I'll come back to at the end, is that calves have to have access to milk for 3 months. So that doesn't mean milk only, but it does mean they've got to have milk for 3 months. And I'll come back to why that is interesting at the end. Beef side of things, suckler beef production is really very, very common. It's very similar to conventional. Remember also that a lot of beef production is coming from the dairy side of things, so beef cross calves out of the dairy. They are really a large part of the beef system, so don't forget about those. But suckler beef production is very similar. Grassland management, parasite management is really important. And think also about the potential welfare compromises that can happen with a suckler calf. So weaning, how are the calves weaned? And what is the farm's process for doing that? And sometimes that in any farm can be pretty brutal. Calves with mum one day and then it's hoiked off her, put on a lorry and sent through a market. Are they sold as stores? What are the market options for the farm? Thinking about the procedures which are common, so castration, dehorning, transport, and abattoir. How do we manage these things to be as welfare friendly as possible? But these are considerations that happen on all farms, not just organic ones. Brief mention about pigs. There's not very many organic pigs, but most of them are associated with beef, sheep, or arable mixed enterprises. Feeding is really expensive because they've got to have outdoor access, so they do burn up a lot of calories keeping warm. They've got to have access to forage, whether that's hay, straw, grass, silage, and there are quite a range of different breeds and crossbreeds that are used in organic systems because they do perform a bit better than some of the more intensive sort of hybrid strains for commercial farms. Land management is really difficult because pigs make a real mess, and that can go horribly wrong, but it can go very, very well as well. These pictures are from organic unit in England, which integrated pigs with arable. The pigs were rotated around. So when they had kind of, for a better word, trashed the ground, then they can plough it, reseed it with arable and move the pigs around. That worked really well. You're not allowed to routinely castrate teal dog, teeth clip, or give iron injections. But I think that in a well-managed pig system with this degree of environmental stimulation, you don't see the same problems that you do in a lot of other farms. Poultry, again, must have outdoor access. There can be issues again with land management, predation, and biosecurity is the big concern at the moment, because you should be aware of bird flu as a risk. There is a much longer growing period. They're not allowed to be killed before they're 81 days old, compared to sort of 40, 42 days, which is conventional. I've got something to highlight to you at the end of, about poultry production, which I'll come back to. Therefore, because you've got pretty much double the amount of rearing time, there's a large price difference at point of purchase. And that's why, if you're a poor student, you're probably not going to go and buy an organic roasting chicken at realistically 12 or 14 pounds compared to cheap chicken, which is maybe £5. And there's a reason why it's cheap, and there's a reason why it's more expensive. There's a huge variety of producers. Some of the smaller producers may process on farm, so you might get involved in meat inspection. Welfare can be an issue because there's a huge variety of organic. You're not allowed to beak clip, and feather pecking can be an issue, and that's really difficult to control once it's in your flock. And just to sort of finish up, you can get farmed fish organically. Soil Association developed standards for farmed fish in the 1990s. The big picture on your screen is fish cages on the west coast of Scotland. Some of you may have seen those. There's a lot of different rules for different species, but the one that's most commonly seen is farmed salmon. But there's a lot of debate about sustainability and appropriateness of this as an organically farming system, because of the interactions with wild fish, the potential for being a sort of reservoir, if you like, of sea lice, and the environmental impact that you get from these high densities of fish. The fish food, because salmon are normally carnivorous, and they would eat other fish, when they're fed in fish farms, they're fed fish meal made of other fish which are trawled out of the sea. The organic system to get around that is using byproducts from fish processing. So they're not harvesting fish just to make fish meal to feed them with, but it's still marginal, I would say, from an environmental point of view. So you'll see lots of animal welfare claims. This is just a screenshot from the Soil Association website saying that animal welfare is one of the most important aspects of organic farming. Soil Association has the highest standards of welfare on any farming system in the UK. And we can debate that if you want. And are there potential problems? You've mentioned this already right at the beginning. Therapeutics, drugs. Can this prolong problems? Are farmers avoiding medicines? I would just come back to the point that I think this is less of an issue than we probably fear. I think in reality, and if you get everything else on board and working well, if you're focusing with your farmers on preventative health measures, then actually not using medicines is not an issue. Bigger issues can be poor stockmanship. So you know as well as we know that you get good farmers and bad farmers. So I think poor stockmanship can be an issue. And I really highlighted here that poor veterinary advice or no advice, I think, is probably the biggest issue and where you can make the biggest difference. Because there is this kind of disconnect sometimes of vets thinking I can't do anything, and organic farmers thinking my vet just wants to sell me medicines. And I think we need to try and break that down. So I think there are lots of opportunities. I think it's really important. The reason I've talked about the market and why I think that's important is that whole food chain approach is really important to understand what the consumer is demanding and what the legislation says. But it does give you an opportunity to think a bit differently to solve problems. And I think that's something where you can get job satisfaction. When you go into your veterinary careers, you may start to get bored with squeezing dogs' anal glands after a while and doing all that really tedious stuff. But there are farmers out there who are doing different things And that gives you perhaps a little bit more kind of career challenge and satisfaction, rather than just doing same old, same old. So one example, I talked already about dairy calves having to get access to milk for 3 months. So this is an example. This is Scottish farmer David Finlay at the Ethical Dairy. They very deliberately and provocatively called themselves the Ethical Dairy, but they keep their dairy cows with their calves. The calves are at foot, and they don't get weaned until they're about 5 or 6 months old. And they run them together. The cows go through the parlour, and the calves are still with them. If you're interested in that, then have a look on their website. It's a farm that we have done work with before, and we're continuing to do some work with. But they're a very interesting example of one way that you can do things differently. And it is very different. It's quite a kind of change of mindset to do this, but it works very well. And this is sort of something which can just give you a little bit of interest in your day-to-day. So just to finish up, really, does organic farming offer an opportunity for a life worth living? If we come back to that concept of the 5 domains model and a life worth living, does organic farming give you that opportunity? So I'm going to now just get you to another poll, just to make sure that everyone's awake. All right. Okay, so hopefully you can see that. You didn't have to say this just because I said I was external examiner at Cambridge. Okay, that's good to know. Next question. Is animal welfare better on organic farms? Okay, there's still a hardcore. Okay. Why do you think it might be different? Okay. I like some of the comments that are in here. I'm particularly interested that someone who said it isn't, and seems quite similar is another comment. And I think, personally, I think that welfare has potential to be better. That's my opinion. I would say the potential is there. And I think somebody has said here, especially for pigs, they may have better welfare because of ability to express natural behaviors. And I would 100% agree with that sentiment. I think there is potential. I think there is more opportunity. There is more choice for animals in a lot of situations. But I think it's not a mutually exclusive welfare is always better situation. What I do want to come back to is that a couple of you there have said reluctance to use drugs and less drug use. I suppose if I was devil's advocate, and you can come back to me and berate me on this one, but does that mean that you associate that using medicines is better welfare? If you flip that on its head, does using medicines mean you've got better welfare? And I think that's kind of the important bit to think about, because medicines doesn't equal because you've got the ability to use medicines, it doesn't mean that you necessarily are going to be in a better welfare situation. I think what we need to consider is, have we got those options and how do we use them? And my argument would be that in an organic situation, you have got those options, you can use them, but they shouldn't be your place of first resort, if you see what I mean. So I've got a few questions that have come up in this as well. I think we've probably got time for a couple of questions. I don't know if you're going to get cut off, but there's a couple of questions come up on this that I will come back to. Can teasers be used for synchronization in organic farming? Yes, is the short answer to that. Don't think there's much more to be said about that other than yes, you can. I'm just going to try and share my screen again with you so that you can all see the questions. Okay. So yeah, comment here. If you need the drugs, then it improves welfare. Absolutely agree with that. And again, I would emphasize that in an organic situation, you're the vet, you're the clinician, you're the person who's able to make that judgment call. Nobody is going to argue with you to say that you can't treat an individual animal or a group of animals if they need to be treated. What you should be considering is, how do we, in the future, looking ahead, how can we try and reduce that problem or mitigate against that happening again? What other questions have we got here? If we give, I'm trying to move my little box so I can see it. If we give analgesia with routine procedure, does that count as one of your treatment courses? No. So that's answering that one. Do organic Holsteins have better mothering ability than the conventional dairy herd? I'm not quite sure I understand the question, whether you mean organic Holsteins or...
We're on mute. Oh, you're muted. Can you hear us?
Yep.
Oh, cool. I think I meant more down the line of, like, quite a lot of dairy farmers anecdotally have said that, like, their Holsteins will just walk off when they've calved and leave their calf. Like, have we bred out mothering ability out of the conventional dairy herd? Like, do organic Holsteins seem to have a better mothering ability if they're actually having calves on them for 3 months?
I think you can feed them milk from a feeder for 3 months.
But then what's the point?
Well, the fact that you're not weaning them at like 8 weeks, I think is the point.
Yeah, but if they're not drinking,
they're not drinking from the cow, I don't think.
No.
In most,
Yeah.
that's that exception.
But then what's the point? I just don't understand the point if they're not drinking from the cow.
I think you're asking two questions there. So one question is, do Holsteins as a breed mother well? And I think there's not enough work on a cow with calf system to be able to answer that question. I know that some cow with calf systems have had like a nurse cow. So there's maybe been a Holstein cow that's had perhaps 3 calves put on her. So that's sometimes some farmers have done this with high cell count cows. They don't put her into the tank, but they just use her to rear calves. There's just not enough information out there, I think, to answer that question. There are currently 18 in the UK farms that do cow with calf of varying sizes. The Finleys with the ethical dairy are the biggest one. They've milk 130. So they're commercial scale. They're a large farm. Their cattle are not Holstein. They are a sort of 3-way cross of Norwegian Red, Montbéliard, and Friesian. So they're not Holstein themselves. I think the short answer to that is we don't know whether Holsteins would, you know, in an organic situation, if you left them with cow with calf, would mother. I suspect they probably would, in honesty. But I think that we can't answer that for sure. So I think that's answering that question. The question of how do you feed them milk for 3 months if they're not with a cow is that most organic farms will just feed them whole milk, either from a bucket or a trough or a teat or whatever, for 3 months. Usually they start them on a teat and then they'll move on to a trough as they get a bit older. So as long as they're getting whole milk, they can have whatever else alongside it, but they don't have to be with mum. But being with mum kind of cuts out the middleman to some extent, and there's a lot of advantages to it. One interesting advantage, well, there's a number of different things that are very different about it, but they are essentially a suckler calf. They will drink a lot of milk. You get less milk in your milk tank, but what you do get is incredibly good growth rates with your calves. So you've effectively got a suckler calf, and it's growing, you know, easily 1.5 kilos a day. So they reach puberty and they reach breeding age a lot quicker. So you have got, it swings and roundabouts. You lose milk that goes into the tank, but you are getting a much quicker calf growth rate. So yeah, they are incredibly greedy. You know, we actually do underfeed calves a lot of the time artificially, and they will easily drink 10 plus litres a day, easily, if you let them have free reign with mum. Question here about withdrawal periods. It's a very good question. The longer withdrawal is not, inverted commas, a science reason. It's pretty arbitrary to have that 2 or 3 times. It really is a deterrent. It's really to deter people from using medicines when they don't need to. It's important to know, though, with a withdrawal period, or a withdrawal period means that you don't have 0 product in your meat or your milk, or whatever it is that you're producing. It means it's below a certain threshold level. So it doesn't mean you have none. It means it's below a certain threshold, and that varies depending on the product. So there are advocates within the organic sector who will say, well, there is still a residue of product X in your meat or your milk or whatever, even if you've observed the data sheet withdrawal period, and therefore having a longer withdrawal is necessary. But making it double or triple the withdrawal period is utterly arbitrary, because, as you should be aware, you know, the half-life of different products is going to be very, very different. When this does become a little bit of an issue in terms of practicalities is if you're dealing with things that have long withdrawals, like flucicides, which then you're sometimes looking at a withdrawal period of months before an animal can go to slaughter. So it's not a welfare issue, but you do just need to be very aware that you advise farmers appropriately before they put food into the food chain. But I would argue that's not a welfare issue. That's more to do with not annoying your farmer because he can't send his finished cattle to slaughter because you've given them a long-acting flucicide.
Along the same lines, if you've got an organic farm and you do give, like, I don't know, a batch of near ready calves, some drug of some description, just something that has a withdrawal on it, can you send them at the normal withdrawal time, so not the 2 to 3 times the length, and just send them as not an organic animal?
Yes.
And can they graze alongside the rest of the herd, be not an organic animal, and then be sent as not an organic animal? Is that allowed?
Yeah, so you're effectively, you're managing a whole lot organically, so everything would be managed organically, but you would have, if you have had that situation where you're sending something with after the normal, the proper withdrawal period or whatever you want to call it, and you send them in, then they could be slaughtered as non-organic, and that's not an issue. They'll have been raised organically. You can't do anything different in terms of your grazing management, because then you would nullify your organic status for everything else. But you would have to manage the farm organically. But yes, you can. And it happens all the time with cull cows in particular. So I do a lot of work with an organic beef herd. And this particular farmer just last week sent away 3 beef cows, which we'd scanned as not in calf. And they were going away as culls. And it just depends on when you can get an abattoir slot. And, he just sent them away. So they've been born, raised, or whatever for their lives. They were organic cull cows essentially, but they're going into the conventional chain because the market is so complicated and convoluted, and there's not a huge number of abattoirs which are certified to do organic kill lines, because you have an organic abattoir, well, an abattoir which does organic and non-organic kills, and they'll put the organic ones through first. Because the volume that they're processing is quite small, there's a small number that will take them. And actually there is nowhere at the moment in Scotland that will that will take a beef cow that's cull as an organic cull cow. She just has to go into the conventional cull cow line. So I've probably given you quite a confusing answer to that, but yes, you can send something and put it into the non-organic side of things. It doesn't upset your certification, as long as everything else is being managed organically.
Okay, thank you.
Right. Can you rear organic beef calves from non-organic dairy cows? If the cow was not organic and you convert your farm, it's all about how you manage your whole farm. And if your farm is being managed organically for that 2-year conversion period, and that calf is born on that farm and is managed organically from day one, yes, you can, if you're in a period of conversion. So its mum might not be organic, but it's as long as it was born onto an organic holding and managed organically, then yes, you can. So hopefully that answers that question. Mutilations in organic farming, are they allowed? Drugs the same. Yes, you are allowed to castrate, disbud, dehorn cattle, and you are allowed to castrate lambs. It's encouraged to be as welfare friendly as possible. So it is encouraged that you would use non-steroidals at the time in cattle. If you're castrating calves, you should use non-steroidals. You absolutely should use local anesthetic, unless you're ringing in the first 7 days of birth with an illustrator. There is debate about whether that's the most welfare friendly way of castrating calves, whether that gives you the optimum. That's a whole other discussion we can go into another day maybe. There are ways with lambs that you can mitigate the pain associated with ringing them. I don't know if any of you have seen a thing called numb nuts. It's a brilliant name. So it's a system which gives local anesthetic at the same time as you're ringing them, and that's a way of mitigating some of that pain associated with castration. So yes, you would be very much encouraged to look at ways of mitigating any pain associated with that, in the same way that all farmers would be encouraged to do that. And a lot of supermarkets and some of the big retailers have got quite strict rules about what you can and can't do to be a supplier for them. So yeah, I mean, I think we should all be aiming for that. And I think as a veterinary profession, sometimes we are not perhaps as good as we could and should be about using these products. I think sometimes we assume the farmer's not going to pay. If I say I want to give all his calves non-steroidals when I castrate them, he's not going to pay. But we've made that judgment for them without asking them. So I think we should have that conversation and be more proactive as a profession. If any of you are interested, the British Cattle Veterinary Association has a sort of position statement on calf welfare, and it talks very much there about we should be using non-steroidals at every opportunity. We should be using local anaesthetic. Apart from anything else, it's illegal to not use local anaesthetic if your calf is older than 2 months old. So yes, you can do these routine procedures in some species, not in pigs, but you should be trying to mitigate that. Should we as a profession be promoting red tractor? Yes, I think we should. I think we should be promoting farming generally. I think farming is getting a hard time. I think farming gets a hard time because it's a scapegoat for environmental issues at the moment. I think we should be standing up and promoting farming as being a solution, not just a problem. And I think we should be standing up and promoting that on the majority of farms, welfare is very good and it is improving all the time. That's not to say that it's not good all the time, and that there are some farms which do have problems. So I think we need to be honest and open about that. And it will be something that will challenge you in your professional careers. You will have welfare issues that you come across, but I think generally speaking, we have very high standards of welfare in this country. If we start exporting our welfare issues overseas, that's a very different issue. I'll come back to the chicken comment later. Other question here: how do you overcome distrust from farmers when they only call you onto farm when they can't deal with? I can't actually see the end of that comment. Can't deal with the problem themselves, so you probably want to use drugs. As a tricky one. It's easy to say communication is key, but communication is key. And I think trying to build up a relationship with your farm clients is really, really important. But you will obviously get some farmers who are difficult to work with. That happens all the time. And I think you'd have to try and find some, it is really difficult. And I think you have to try and find some common ground with them. And build up a relationship as much as you can. If you're interested, these are some really good links to have a look at. And there's more information there on certification. Soil Association is a great source of information, but be aware that they are both a certification body and a campaigning organisation. So they have a campaigning arm, which will always tell you that organic is wonderful. But they also have a certification arm, and they also do have some quite useful information on their website. So don't be, just be very aware when you read what they put out. And if any of you are interested, this is really worth listening to. There's a series on the radio at the moment. I am giving away my middle-agedness by telling you that I listen to Radio 4. But you can get this on BBC Sounds and just listen to the episodes. Chris Van Tulken is a human medic. He did lots of kids programs. He's very engaging as a presenter. And he is talking a lot about chicken, Planet Chicken, and chicken welfare and chicken, how we produce chicken and how we farm it and what we do with it, and how the chicken has been changed really dramatically. They do have a mention in the whole series. Not all of the episodes have been put up yet, but they do mention organic in this, and they do explain the differences between different rearing systems and the opportunities that chickens have for expressing natural behavior within those systems. So there's 3 episodes online at the minute, I think, but worth listening to if you're into that kind of thing. So I would advise you to just have a listen to that. And just to finish up, if anybody is interested, that's all the kind of links there for AWF. And I would really, really advocate you looking at their student resource area, because the scenarios are brilliant. They give you lots of different ones for different species. Do think about the student grants, and do think about either attending the discussion forum, or if you can't attend, then have a look online, because there are YouTube videos of the talks that cover multiple different topics. So that's me, and I'm aware that